When we think of Norse mythology, we probably picture Thor with his hammer, Odin with his one eye, Loki the trickster. It's a world that feels so familiar to us now. But the real story, the one we're going to dig into today, is how these tales even survived at all. And trust me, it's a genuine historical detective story. And that question right there, that's the central mystery. See, unlike so many other ancient religions, there was no Viking Bible. There was no sacred book written by believers during the Viking Age itself. So if they didn't write it down, how on earth do we have all these incredibly detailed stories centuries later? To find our first clue, we've got to go back and understand that Norse paganism wasn't a religion that was just founded one day. It was something that grew, organically over thousands of years in a world where memory and the spoken word, well, they were everything. This is such an important point. I want you to picture it. A smoky longhouse, a fire roaring in the middle, a chieftain and their warriors all gathered around. These myths weren't something you'd curl up with a book to read quietly. No, they were performances. They were living, breathing events that carried the history, the beliefs, and the very soul of a people from one generation to the next. So, okay, if these stories were performed, who exactly was doing the performing? I mean, who was responsible for remembering thousands and thousands of lines of incredibly complex poetry? Well, that brings us to the next key players in our investigation. The skalds. These guys were so much more than just entertainers. In a culture that didn't really have widespread writing, they were basically the living hard drives, the keepers of history and sacred knowledge. And they used these unbelievably complex poetic forms to lock that information in place, making it really memorable and stable over time. One of their coolest tools was something called a kenning. It's kind of like a poetic riddle. So instead of just saying the sea, a skald might call it the whale road. These kennings, plus really strict rules about alliteration and rhyme, made the poems incredibly difficult to change. It was like a form of oral data protection. So for centuries, this oral system just worked. It was perfect. But then a massive cultural shift comes barreling into Scandinavia. It's a turning point that threatens to completely erase the old ways. But also, and this is the paradox, it becomes the very reason these stories were saved at all. As you can see from this timeline, over about 150 years, all the major Norse kingdoms officially converted to Christianity. Now, with this huge change, the old gods get replaced, and that whole religious structure that supported the skalds and their stories, it just starts to fade away. And this right here, this brings us to the absolute core of our historical puzzle. The people who finally wrote all these myths down, they weren't pagan Vikings. They were literate Christian scholars, looking back at what they saw as an ancient pagan past. So where did all this writing happen? Our investigation now takes us to one very specific place, an island way out in the North Atlantic that became the unlikeliest guardian of this ancient heritage, Iceland. Specifically, we have two key documents, our exhibits A and B, if you will. They're known as the Eddas. The Poetic Edda is a collection of really old poems from that oral tradition, gathered up by some anonymous compiler. But the big one, the Prose Edda, that's our most comprehensive guide, and it was written almost like a textbook for future poets. And that textbook brings us to the star witness of our entire investigation, the author of the Prose Edda. But as we're about to see, our star witness comes with a major complication, something historians call the Christian filter. This is our guy, Snorri Sturluson. He was an Icelandic politician, a brilliant historian, and a master poet. Just about everything we think of as the story of Norse mythology, from the creation of the world all the way to the final battle of Ragnarok, it comes to us primarily through his work. He is an absolutely indispensable source. Snorri's whole goal was to preserve the old poetic arts, which were, completely steeped in mythology. But this raises a really, really critical question for our investigation. What did the man himself actually believe? And here's the twist. Snorri was a devout Christian. He wasn't writing a holy book for a living religion. He was working as a historian, an academic, trying to make sense of his ancestors' beliefs from his own 13th century Christian viewpoint. So he inevitably selected, organized, and interpreted everything in a way that would make sense to him and his world. So, where does that leave us? I mean, if our main source was written 200 years after the Viking Age by a guy from a totally different religion, what can we really know? Probably the best way to think about it is like this. We're not looking at a perfect, crystal clear photograph of Norse paganism. Instead, what we're doing is looking through a window. It's a really old window, and the glass is kind of colored by Snorri's Christian beliefs and just the simple passage of time. We can still see the world outside, but we always have to remember we're looking through that filter. But you know what? Knowing this doesn't diminish the power of the myths. I think it actually enhances them. It turns us, the readers, into historical detectives. It invites us to look for the clues, to question the source, and to really appreciate the incredible, fragile journey these stories took to get from a firelit hall to a written page. And ultimately, the story of the Viking myths leaves us with a much, much bigger question, one that honestly applies to all of history. It forces us to ask, how often are the stories we learn shaped not just by the events of the past, but by the beliefs and the motivations of the people who finally got to hold the pen?